Welcome to Trinity Radio. And I'm only now remembering on this inaugural episode of Biblical Rogues Gallery that I was going to let Jonathan intro the show. So, Jonathan?
Well, you ruined that. Anyway, welcome everybody to our first inaugural Biblical Rogues Gallery. We have quite the lineup tonight. You'll never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. In this panel we have with us tonight, we are going to be going through the book of Romans on Thursday nights, and we hope to have a mixture of regulars and guests tonight. We've got a special guest that we'll introduce here in a moment, but first we want to go around the horn, introduce MJ Jackson's with us tonight. MJ, who are you and what do you do?
Well, grace and peace to the panel of guests, and grace and peace to the chat. I'm like you said, MJ Jackson. I am in Tyler, Texas, but I'm from the Fort Worth area. I have a YouTube channel where we talk apologetics, urban apologetics, political theology, practical theology, public theology. So we talk a little bit about everything, and we're just seeking to apply the biblical worldview to all areas of life. And so that's what my channel is known for. My co-host on my channel is Chris Samuel. He's not here tonight, but he might pop in one of these days. But he's a regular on the channel, and nice to meet you all of you guys, and glad to be here.
All right, our special guest tonight is Leighton Flowers, who's probably not a stranger to the folks on this channel. He's appeared. Leighton, tell them a little bit about what you got going on these days.
Yeah, well, as you said, I'm Leighton Flowers. I'm the director of evangelism and apologetics for Texas Baptist. I also am a professor at Trinity Seminary, the best seminary in the world.
Amen.
And some people know me from Soteriology 101, where we broadcast about soteriology, specifically about the doctrines called provisionism, in contrast to what is known as Calvinism or Reformed theology, where we theology geek out on the doctrines of God's grace and His goodness and salvation, and that gets a little bit contentious sometimes because it's between a debate over contentious subject matter. But I like to remind people that that's just a side thing that I enjoy doing. But I love just getting with brothers like this and talking about all kinds of things as well. So thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I saw a rumor that you seem to have no life outside of talking about this subject, even though you have 4 kids, you have a wife that you love dearly, a full-time job, you preach in churches on a regular basis, and sometimes, yes, the one-string banjo.
Yeah, that's my one-string banjo right there, baby.
But every now and then you talk about soteriology on a YouTube channel bigger than all of ours. Anyway, we also have Will Hess. Will.
Hey, hi. Sorry. Right when the countdown ended, it kicked me. So I think that was Braxton just trying to get rid of me.
Yeah.
But
he was jealous. He was jealous of your beard, Will.
It's true, and it's mainly because my beard is far better than his. Also, I have hair on the top of my head.
Hey! And you know what? I kicked MJ a second ago, and I kicked you, and I'll kick you again.
Anyway, my name's Will Hess. I am in ministry. Actually, I work with Pastor Brett, who's above there hanging out with Braxton. But I also am the host of the Church Split YouTube channel and podcast. You can find us at the Church Split. I'm usually accompanied by my co-host as well, Brian Bodie, and he might, who knows, join us from time to time. But normally him and I do our streams Monday night, so you can come check us out there. We talk about literally about anything from church hurt to apologetics to theology to basically anything that can be divisive in your church. So come check us out if you like to get a little saucy.
Very good. You pointed out Brett Nicholson. Brett, how are you doing? Tell us who you are.
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm Brett Nicholson, and I'm Braxton's pastor, and I think I'm Jonathan's pastor. I can't tell so far, and at times I'm Will Hess's boss. He's our student minister guy, and so I regularly receive confessions from these guys. Kind of cool, and so I have an insight.
We gotta talk after this, Brett. I gotta get some.
Absolutely, we can. And I can be bought. I can.
No confessional
get anything out of me you want. I'm not above any of that kind of thing. We also have a YouTube channel called One Life Network, and where we talk about church issues and responding to culture. The mission statement is to change the worldview of the next generation, and so we do talk about worldview issues, like MJ was talking a while ago, and we're pursuing an active partnership with Trinity, and that's been a lot of fun.
That's right.
And
It has.
We're making it happen.
In fact, real quick, I'll just add, since I don't know that I need to be introduced on my own channel, although there's probably people coming from other channels, but Brett and I put together last year a series that Brett preached through, and based on my book Core Facts. And now right now in the second semester of teaching people through Core Facts, and he preached sermons related to the points of Core Facts, and we launched that out, we think, successfully. And so there it is, MJ. Hey, you got the new edition.
And we had our congregation read it. That was their reading plan. Yeah.
And so the idea will be that Brett and I and Jonathan hopefully can in the future get other churches to adopt what we did and try to get apologetics into your church that way real practically. Because I think if you're a pastor out there, there are a lot of pastors who would agree with all the apologists. Yes, I need to get apologetics in my church, but they don't know how to do it. And so we're offering kind of a plug and play way to do it. But anyway, I'm so glad that Brett's here, and people that have been watching for a long time have probably seen him on the channel before.
Yeah, I'm glad Brett's here as well, though it's not the best look to introduce our pastor by saying you did all his sermon prep.
Hey, no, I'm not dumb. I mean, why not? Just save a little. I do the version of all his work. Absolutely. Yes, I've learned a few things doing this for a while.
Now, this might be odd to hear from one of your church members, but this is the first time that I'm going to say the reason why that we wanted Brett here tonight, when we're not even talking about Bible verses yet in the book of Romans, but we're introduction stuff, is to get a pastor's perspective on things, because pastors, they deal with the Bible as much as scholars do, as much as theology geeks do. And so we wanted a pastor here tonight to help communicate why we think, whether it's in sermon prep or why lay people even should be interested in all of that introduction material that you find in these commentaries or whatever, to introduce a book of the Bible to help orient it. So a pastor's perspective is going to be real helpful. And because I consider, and you may not hear this from any other church member, I consider the pastor to actually be a real job. Having watched this man, I know that pastors work more than twice a week.
This is it. That's amazing.
Pastors do work more than 2 days a week. And as long as he keeps buying me lunch, I will keep saying that.
Thank you so much.
All right. So before we get into the book of Romans, there are some things that happened this week and the past couple of weeks that we just can't ignore. So we want to talk about them. And especially when we have one of the originators of this big kerfluffle on the internet lately, if you follow the soteriology debates, we have Leighton Flowers here to tell us all about #Baalgate.
I was told this was going to be an intervention for Jonathan Pritchett. I don't know what y'all are talking about, but
nope, I brought the gasoline for the fire, buddy.
Yeah. Apparently, we had one of our long, 2 or 3 hour kind of videos with Warren McGrew was on with Jordan Hatfield. And we were just talking, long video. So we had a lot of different little things that we were talking about along the way. And we were talking about election along the way and different things about election and how the mindset of election with the concept of Calvinism. And Warren said something kind of provocative, and I didn't even register with me that it was even provocative at the time because it was in the context of a lot larger discussion. But we're giving Jordan a real hard time, even though it's all turned out for the good, because he clipped out a little section of it and kind of put it out there on Twitter with this provocative question, and it got the kind of clicks that you're often looking for when you're looking for clicks. If that's what it's looking for, it got them.
Yeah, some of that black magic, Leighton. That's what I call it. The Calvinism
quite provocative.
It'll get you the clicks. But at what cost?
Exactly. But what Warren was talking about was, many people don't know Warren and know that he grew up in a very high kind of Calvinist home, where almost like the Westboro Baptist type of Calvinist. I mean, almost that bad. Even openly taught infant damnation and those kinds of things. Really, really hardcore stuff. And so something I'd said about being, choosing, God may choose your child, may not choose your child, that kind of thing. And you got to be willing to still worship a God that does that. That's really hard. How would you deal with that kind of thing? And then we went on to talk about some other things. And then he kind of reflected back on that. And he was talking about how the same mindset that's willing to, worship a pagan deity and put your baby onto a fire in order to get your crops and those kinds of things. It's that same kind of mindset that would be willing to adopt this concept of infant damnation. He doesn't mention infant damnation, but he just says, the same kind of mindset that a Calvinist must have to be able to worship a God that they think, would, damn a child, to not save your infant. And so it's a very provocative topic as it is, but especially when it was clipped out the way that it was. And so the Calvinists went up and very upset because it made, for them, some of them interpreted it as saying parents, Calvinistic parents don't care about their kids. They're willing to, sacrifice them as long as they get elect, that kind of thing. And Warren was not saying that. Obviously, we both were Calvinistic parents ourselves. And so we didn't obviously have no care for our children or something like that. But he was expressing the mindset of someone willing to worship a deity that would sacrifice children or that would damn a child or something like that. You're willing to still worship that God, even with that ability. And we were relating it to C.S. Lewis's quote about if his good is our bad and our bad is his good, you could worship an all-powerful demon kind of a thing, because you can turn God into a form of devil worship. If you're willing just to accept what anybody says about God, and you're willing to worship God no matter what people say about him, your theology's probably gone too far. And so that was the kind of the point behind the quote. But the way it was taken was that, people thought that he was saying that, reform, parents don't care about their kids or something like that, as long as they get elected. And that's not the point that he was trying to make. Anyway. Yeah, that's where the ball gate came out.
Let me speak. Go ahead, Leighton. Continue.
Well, I was just going to say, and then he clarified and said, well, I was talking specifically about those who believe in infant damnation, and most Calvinists today don't believe in infant damnation. They believe that all babies that die are elect. And so I wasn't even talking about most of you. If the shoe doesn't fit, why are y'all so worried? And he was going, no. And people were saying, no, nobody believes that anyway. No, some of the people on the internet were saying, no, Calvinist really believes that. And we're like, well, James White does. James White believes that some infants are elect and some aren't. And he says that really clearly. Well, and so we did another broadcast explaining and showing clips from James White, where he, back in 1987, thought that was an inconceivable view, but now he actually holds to that view, that God can choose to elect infants and damn infants, and that's his prerogative, his freedom to do that if he wishes. And we were speaking out against that concept for obvious reasons. It is an inconceivable view to believe that God would choose to damn any infant that dies or that's aborted. And so that's the basic nutshell of the controversy, if that helps.
Well, before you carry on, Jonathan, I know that most of you guys on the stream have probably already seen the post I made just a couple hours ago, but I'm going to read it here for posterity, a portion of it. But I haven't said anything about this issue. I have friends that have on both sides of this, obviously. And but here's the way I said it earlier. There was some recent controversy between some of my friends in the online theological world. Parallels of some sort were drawn between issues surrounding a doctrine known as infant damnation and issues surrounding pagan child sacrifice. And here's my favorite line of the whole post. The world of online theological debate can be a strange place. I enjoy having many Calvinist and non-Calvinist friends. Some of my Calvinist friends, whether this is the correct interpretation or not, drew conclusions from these comments that they took to be personal offenses, either toward themselves or others. Whatever the original point may have been, I just wish to state, and I do, that I do not think of, for instance, my friend Chris Day as having anything like the moral character, motivations, perspectives, or mindset of these ancient pagans. One, I'm not saying they, or the guys in the original post, were trying to say all of that. Two, I'm not calling them out. And three, it's entirely possible I'm still not clear on some nuance of this. Now, much of this is revolved around the use of the word mindset, and we were just discussing that. If what one means by mindset is something like both ancient pagans and modern Calvinists have to come to grips with what seems like an incredibly difficult reality, then I can agree. But then I have to come to grips with incredibly difficult realities on my own view. And then I mentioned that it should be noted that I haven't watched all you guys' stuff on this. So that's kind of my take on this. And again, it's not a well-informed take in the sense that I haven't seen everything involved. But there's me.
Yeah, I just want to, so that, because I sense two problems here. The first problem is people will throw fits, and I have a issue with, I hate this, that people will, you said if the shoe doesn't fit, don't wear it. People will throw fits if you don't preface or qualify or issue 100 disclaimers before you say anything. And then they will wear every shoe because they can't automatically assume, okay, well, that's not everybody just because you use a catch-all term like Calvinism. It gets annoying because if you say Calvinists believe, and it doesn't matter what you put in there, one Calvinist is going to throw a fit if he has some nuanced view that's outside of the mainstream. The other problem is when the Westminster Confession of Faith was brought up in some of these discussions, it says elect infants dying in infancy are regenerated and saved by Christ through the Spirit, who worketh when and where and how he pleaseth. So also are all other elect persons who are incapable of being outwardly called by the ministry of the word. Now, giving this the most charitable reading possible, you could, it doesn't say, you could say that as you could go with a negative inference that if there are elect infants and elect persons incapable, that means they're therefore unelect, right? And or you could just say it says elect infants, and we don't know what that total number is. That could include the sum total of all without exception infants and people incapable that God could elect. So I do think charitably reading this, you could go either way. But some people have made statements in the past that are absolutely clear where they stand on this. And it is that they affirm that there will be non-elect infants. And you could, I guess you could just assume, given the ratio of professed believers to non-believers in the world in those proportions, one could assume that the elect and non-elect and the infants or those incapable of being outwardly called by the ministry of the word would be in similar numbers, which means that the majority of people would not be elect. And I think that's a fair assessment, because part of the problem with statements of faith that you want to argue for wiggle room is with the lack of clarity. We do have permission to make assumptions or inferences from what it does say. And it is on the person who affirms these kinds of confessions is to speak out and say, no, I affirm that all infants are elect. Or you can say, I affirm some infants are elect, meaning that if some are, then some aren't. And so there is a place to discuss the doctrine of infant damnation within this context. So I think it's a fair game subject. And it seems like what people want to be outraged about is that Warren said off the cuff, buried in a 3-hour live stream without numerous disclaimers and qualifiers that, of course, not every Calvinist believes, blah, 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 blah. Just
well,
there are
I think, Jonathan, I think on the one hand, we could say that first of all, I'm Mr. Caveat. Jonathan hates about me that I caveat everything to death.
Yeah.
And I can't even hardly talk without caveating everything for just this purpose. And I do agree that it would be nice if you could just say a thing every now and then without feeling like you have to like give all the disclaimers and all of that stuff. So that is true. I will say this. I think that some of the backlash, I guess I could say, after what is the cool thing that kids say, like the clapback, a lot of the clapback or the backlash was really over thoughts about not so much the discussion about the doctrine, but the implications about individuals. And of course, we've already covered that. But anyway, have we milked the algorithm on that enough to move on to Romans, or do you guys want to keep going for a little bit?
We haven't heard from Will or MJ on this whole thing, so
MJ,
go ahead.
Will, MJ, wake up.
No, I'm awake. Like I said, I watched Soteriology, 101, and of course I saw Warren on there, so I knew that this is a joke. I knew somebody was going to be choosing violence when I saw Warren on there. So I qualify a lot of my statements because I believe in nuance. When you're talking about certain things, and I think the problem with pop level Calvinism is they don't necessarily engage with the confessions. And once again, I'm making a statement, and if it don't apply, let it fly. the chat, because I know some people can get uptight about this, but that's something that I've observed. I've observed it in other areas when we're talking about the Bible being the final authority in terms of engaging in social issues. Well, the Westminster Confession of Faith has a whole section on that people are not familiar with, and these are just the types of things that you encounter in these YouTube streets. Pop level theology, and then the more academic theology. And I think that from my outside perspective, I think Warren was just addressing the confessional aspect of Calvinistic theology, and it is what it is.
Right on, MJ. Will, it's your time to shine.
Well, I mean, I already made my thoughts clear in both the Trinity Radio group and my own church split discussion apologetics group regarding at least the outrage that took place, which is the fact that when we're in these online theological discussions, you have to have thick skin. And so I don't expect people to caveat everything, because that just gets overly ridiculous. And it actually can get very pedantic to listen to if everything's caveated 1,000 times. But also, just the nature of it is just, we have to have thick skin. Like I hear people, I mean, I've been called heretic, I've been called all sorts of stuff every day in the comments. I wake up and I open up my YouTube app, and guess what? I'll find some wonderful insult to get me moving for the day. But that's just part of it. And so third-party offenses, I don't ever think is a very mature way for us to live. I don't think it's a good way. I think we have to have a little bit more tough skin when we're engaged into this realm. The other aspect of it is, I mean, I didn't even think what Warren said should have been overly controversial, because if you're still willing to worship a pagan god and burn your child to sacrifice it for blessings of sorts, even if you remove infant damnation out of the equation, you just turn into even your adult children. I mean, I'll go one step further. If it's no matter what, before one was born, doomed from the womb, so to speak, there is still that difficult part you're going to have to wrestle with, which is the fact that your child might be unelect. Even though they might die when they're 84 years old, there's nothing they can do about it, and you're still going to worship God for his glory. So in my mind, I was like, I don't even know why this is overly controversial. Clearly, that's something that's difficult, that's going to have to be wrestled with if predestination and doom from the womb theology is correct in general. So that was kind of my brief take on it, and I'm sure I will get some wonderful hate mail regarding my take, but that's fine.
Actually, I thought that right there was pretty reserved.
Yeah.
So
well, yeah, and actually,
do those caveats
Seth,
if you don't like.
Well, yeah, I was just saying Seth Dillon made, of the Babylon Bee, he made the same point that you just made, Wes, and his response to it. Was just like Will Hess. I always put Will Hess together as Wes. Yeah. I don't know. I do that. I've done that to you twice.
Leighton, it's okay. I just want to make sure everyone is aware that this happens to me regularly, because Will Hess, Wes, it's all the time. So I'm not even mad. It's like my second name at this point.
But Leighton, we are gonna
tonight. You're Wes.
We are gonna, Leighton, because of how beautifully you usually put things. We are gonna put on the sound effect board where you say reprobate, and I'm not even kidding. And I've already got Jonathan has already given me sound clips.
There are things that I've said for years that are mispronounced, and then somebody will finally mention it to me, and I go, "Why are you just now telling me? I didn't even recognize I was doing this."
Who's going to tell him?
And it's usually Pritchett. Pritchett's usually the only honest friend that will actually get on with me and say, "Hey, man, you're an idiot. You're saying the word wrong."
I don't call you an idiot. I mean, tonight you could barely say your job title because you fluffed on evangelism, but we love you for that. Anyway, so my closing thought on this this issue is, part of me thinks that some of the outrage that Will, or Wes, as we're calling him tonight, mentioned was to actually drown out the discussion, the real point about number one, there is a similarity there that you've at some level made peace with uncomfortable doctrines. But I also have to say that as Christians who affirm God exists and that there's evil in the world and that there is an eternal punishment, however you shake that out in your doctrine of hell, there are some uncomfortable things that, even whether you believe God passed over your children or not, or they by their own free will have refused to accept the gospel, we know what God does with such people. So there is uncomfortable doctrines to be talked about all around.
That's my point. That's one of my points. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, with that, I think that we can move on to our next topic before we get to Romans, and that is going to be the topic of Donald Trump, everyone's favorite topic.
Can't we talk about let's talk about infant damnation some more. I really don't.
No, because a dear friend of mine posted a tweet and posted a Facebook post. He's a dear friend. He is a fellow professor. And MJ and I wanted to talk about this because we went round and round, and we're hoping to have Tim come on Trinity Radio one day and hash all this out, because he posted a tweet that if you are a Christian, you have a moral obligation to vote for Trump. And if you fail to live up to that moral obligation in voting for Trump, you have failed to love your neighbor. Well, I don't know if Tim, like the progressive Christians out there who talk about everything in the context of loving your neighbor, even though the neighbor is the Samaritan who's like hurting on the side of the road and you should help him. I don't know what that has to do with voting for giving somebody political power. But I also doesn't know what it has to do with affirming people in their sin either. On the other side on the left side of this coin, when progressives try to guilt evangelicals with Bible phrases that they just kind of toss about willy-nilly. But that is a serious claim that if you don't vote for Trump, you are not sufficiently loving your neighbor, which is a violation of the second commandment, which means you are in sin. So I had to take exception with my dear friend and say, first of all, if you decide to go to your grandmother's house because she baked cookies on election day instead of vote for anyone to have power to tell you how to live your life, you have not committed any act of sin. I mean, you could think of a million things that
you're expressing an opinion right now. Is that what's happening?
No, I'm expressing a biblical fact that God does not mind if you go sit with your grandmother on election day, and please don't fill out a phony ballot in her name for whoever you like, but you're going to actually sit with your grandmother and have cookies. Is if you decide to do that instead of vote for Trump, you have not sinned and violated the second commandment.
Well, you should have had foresight to know that was on election day.
You could have
planned better. If it's a moral obligation, you better do some serious planning.
But I don't think it is.
It's a moral obligation. I better start right now. Get that on.
You have a moral obligation to go see your grandma more than you have voting.
Oh no. Maybe you, pal, not me.
Anyway, that's my take on it. My issue is not who Christians vote for; it's who Christians support. And yes, voting is a minimal amount of support, but I mean, I think if you vote for somebody, if you bother to vote for a candidate, you should be, if you gave them your vote, which they should have to earn, whether it's Trump or whoever, you should criticize the person you stood in a line and had to, wait for a long period of time in some places to give them a vote to put them in office. You should criticize that person more than if your guy loses, more than you criticize the other guy. I do not understand loyalty in politics. But anyway, that's my whole piece on it. I don't care who you vote for. Just I care about who you support, and you don't need to be loyal to a politician. If you vote for somebody and he wins, criticize that person more than if the other guy wins. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Pastor, tell us what we're supposed to really believe about this.
Well, from what I saw, I get the moral. I get how he arrived at moral obligation. I would be very uncomfortable with that kind of language because for lots and lots of reasons. But I've had to ponder these things myself and pray over that, because the political thing is your vote does result in outcomes, and that's unavoidable. And so what he was saying was the outcome in one direction, if the other guy gets in, it's going to lead towards leftist things and communism, which is atheism, and on, it kind of stacks this logic there. And then on the other hand, Trump's ostensibly is going to lead away from that. But to argue that that's going to become moral obligation to vote for Donald Trump, who has proven himself to be, which your friend admitted, that doesn't have the greatest character in the world, and is, my moral obligation is to vote for someone that would be wholly unreliable. I don't know how he's going to do things. He's backing off some certain abortion issues and things like that. Some people are starting to get upset with him because he's showing some compromises that I know a lot of people wouldn't show necessarily. I think he would be better than the other person in a lot of categories. But to get down to, as a Christian conviction, I have to, or I've sinned and I have to show up to confession to you or something because I didn't vote for Donald Trump or anybody else. I'm very uncomfortable with that. And I certainly wouldn't preach that except to you, Jonathan. Maybe I could be selective about what I preach to each congregant.
Yeah. After dumping on Trump on social media for like 6 years, you're going to tell me, well, you better go.
But I'm weighing that out, though. It's choosing directions, and in our system of government too, that's not spoken of in Scripture directly. We're representative government and all that kind of thing. And where's this going to go? It's there's a lot of, speaking of nuance, there's a lot of things to ponder there. But
yeah, now for myself, not that you asked me, Jonathan, but I would just say that I think I obviously concur with my pastor, and I'm a good Southern Baptist and believe in pastoral authority. So I'm going to do whatever my pastor said, and so there's my answer. But
even though I'm not a Southern Baptist,
yeah, even though he's not a Southern Baptist. Well, it's just like Jonathan's an egalitarian, but his wife's a complementarian. So I tell him he should listen to his wife and be complementarian. Yeah, but I will say that I think while all that's true, and I'm not the person it's not my job necessarily to tell you who to vote for. I will say this: I think you look at the issues, and unfortunately, we have to look at things that way. And the truth is, people have heard me say this on the show. It's not that there aren't other incredibly important issues, but unfortunately, many Republicans are backing off of even talking about this or it's almost like they've given up on the whole abortion thing. But the fact of the matter is, I still think that abortion is the most wicked thing that we put our seal of approval on as a nation. And that is going to play in not only to my mind, but I think a lot of other Christians' minds, evangelicals' minds, when they go to vote. And that's also a good reason why if you don't think someone should vote for Donald Trump, and you hear that a Christian friend did vote for Donald Trump, and you want to lambast them for that, at least understand that their thinking might not have so much to do with Donald Trump's policies writ large or the way he acts on Twitter or something, but instead it has to do with they're trying to find a way to navigate to rescue millions of children from being slaughtered.
Yeah, I understand that's an important issue, which is, the overturning of Roe v. Wade with Donald Trump told me that Mike Pence had a lot to say in the judges that were picked, and Trump supporters hate Mike Pence. But our former governor here in Indiana, and by the way, our current governor here in Indiana, who's a Republican, vetoed a bill. Another issue that's very important to Christians is, biblical sexual ethics and the understanding of biblical gender. And our Republican governor here vetoed a bill to prevent young girls from having to deal with boys playing in their sports teams and competing against them. So our Republican governor vetoed that bill. He didn't want to ban dudes from playing sports with women. So anyway, my only thought on that is Republicans aren't much better on the abortion issue when, after overturning Roe v. Wade, Trump now wants to negotiate with Democrats on a 15-week abortion up to 15 weeks as federal law, which dumps over the states that, sure, the ones that wanted abortion all the way till birth, but also dumps on the states that wanted to ban it outright. So Trump is not really the hero on this. Plus, when it comes to
that's my point. You can't call it a moral obligation because you don't know what he's going to do, and if he does something like that, where's the win? You haven't ended with a moral outcome.
Yeah. So a lot of people memory hole Donald Trump's flubs, and I don't. So. MJ, I know that you have something to say about this because you said plenty on Twitter. So.
Yeah, I wasted a bunch of brain cells and many hours of my precious day on Saturday. And Lord, forgive me for engaging in it on the Lord's Day. I have since deleted my Twitter. We'll see how long that lasts. But
I've done that like 3 times.
I think Psalms 146. 3-5 talks about putting our trust in princes and kings, and yeah, I'm gonna pick on Dr. Stratton for a little bit. When I was talking to him, there's almost like some type of existential panic that was flowing in the Twitter feed. And after we look at the issues, the Republican platform has already waffled on sexual ethics, that waffled on marriage, waffled on the transgenderism thing. What we're really left with is economics. And any form of state intervention is considered to be Marxism. Any form of state intervention. Now, I'm going to sound a little bit like David Paulman, but if Christians are going to comment on these type of things, if Christians are going to try to bind the consciousness, the conscience of other Christians to political platforms and political, people who are running for office, you need to know what you're talking about. You need to make sure that you're aware of your blind spots. And so, once again, I don't care who you vote for. I pray. My prayer is that you consult God when you're voting, but my prayer is also that you would understand that the kingdom of God does not function like the world. In other words, when we love our neighbor, you need to, number one, you need to make sure you're defining that scripturally. You need to make sure you're defining that scripturally. Love your neighbor is not some top-down policy-driven matter. It's a bottom-up approach. It's a bottom-up approach. We change the world through being salt and light. We change the world through our actions and modeling what it means to be the people of God, and modeling what it means to engage in righteousness and justice. I think in Romans 6, it talks about how we have died with Jesus and we've been raised to new life. There's your regeneration for everyone, by the way. But it also talks about how we no longer yield our members to injustice or unrighteousness, but we now yield our members to righteousness or justice. That's how you love your neighbor. But I mean, yes, we find ourselves in America, and we've been granted this great privilege to have a say-so in how our government is ran, and we should use that privilege, of course, prayerfully. But we don't lose, we don't panic or lose our mind, because of the specter of certain politicians loom. So that's just my attitude toward the whole thing. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Dr. Stratton. Love him. Had a good time in Texas with him and Josh Klein. By the way, Dr. Pritchett, Nick would like in on this conversation too, if we can make that happen as well.
Well, that's up to how many people Braxton wants to referee, because I know that Tim's got a buddy he wants to bring on, a fellow minister that we met in Texas as well. So, Leighton, Will, y'all, Wes, I'm sorry.
Are you guys saying? Wait a minute. Are you guys saying that Nick wants on right now, MJ?
No. He wants on when on Trinity Radio when we schedule Tim and everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, when it comes to, by the way, I did edit my name to say Wes just because I couldn't help myself. But anyway, I don't know. Whenever the Pastor Brett what has been saying the last few weeks, that continually bringing up that it's election year and all the crap that tends to bring up out of people and out of the culture and things. This is for me what happens when you take the political issues of this world and the kingdoms of this world and you elevate them way too high. MJ put it perfectly when it's the wrong approach. Like, I don't look to the state to love my neighbor. Like, I don't vote for a particular person in the state to love my neighbor. I'm supposed to love my neighbor and change the culture from within in that sense. And plus, we are a constitutional republic. It's actually one of our rights, whether or not you want to vote or not to vote. There's no moral obligation one way or the other. And that's the whole point, is that you don't have to. And I don't think a Christian should sit against their own conscience if they don't feel like they can, in good conscience, vote for somebody. That's what individual soul liberty is if you're a good Baptist. Okay. and I'm just saying Baptist because we all know that's what you're supposed to say, I guess, if you're from the South.
That's what Leighton says.
We forget that there's a T, Baptist, but it's fine. But that's one of the things. It's like we are individuals, and we have individual soul liberty through Christ. And if no one should violate their conscience, and I know that there's certain people who really do struggle with even the idea of voting for Trump or even voting for a larger part of the Republican caucus, so to speak, because they have waffled on things like sexuality, on things like abortion, and so many other issues. So I don't agree with Dr. Stratton. And Dr. Stratton is a good friend of mine. I love Dr. Stratton. And, I'm a pretty conservative person myself, and I can't ever see myself voting blue. And I can say that out pretty.
Oh yeah, I can't stand I can't stand the Democrat Party.
I
have no problem saying that.
But it's just one of those things where I don't think I can sit there in good conscience say that, especially when the context of loving your neighbor is not within something like voting for a particular political party. In fact, we were told not to put our faith in kings. And
my thing is this: I know in election year, I'm old now. I'm actually a grandfather, so I can say I'm officially old. You can't say I'm not old. And as a grandfather, I've lived for a long time now, and every 4 years, it's the most important election of our lifetime. And like I said a minute ago, I don't like the Democrat Party. And if you don't like what's going on in this country because you don't like the Democrat Party either, hey, I get it. But guess what? If the most pressing issue for the church is a Democrat will get elected and we live and die by 4 years, we are bigger babies than women in Rome in the first century. So settle down.
Am I supposed to say something? It just got quiet.
It went quiet. All right.
It was real authoritative there for a
I think
moment.
you're supposed to say Romans.
Yeah.
Romans.
Let's go on to Romans. Yeah.
Let's go on to Romans. We actually have I actually put together a PowerPoint. I don't know if Braxton's going to show the PowerPoint because he hadn't showed anything else that I prepared for him to put up on the board.
So we're not going to talk about razor wire. Dang.
Oh, man.
Oh, the razor wire. That's right. Yeah.
Next week, bro. Next week.
Oh, man.
We're already 43 minutes into this. Romans. We're going to introduce the book of Romans. And as people who followed our channel know, I am not a Pauline guy. I like Peter because he wrote fewer letters. So it's less to deal with. You've got, Mark, 1st and 2nd Peter, and the first third of Acts, and then you don't have to worry about much except for Paul calling him out in Galatians. But Pauline theology is kind of a big deal to a lot of people, and I thought, why not do a Romans roundtable and talk about the book of Romans? And what I love about the book of Romans is it's a letter that Paul wrote, and we're going to go through the various options that people have said what his primary purpose in writing the letter was. But if he had more than one, we know that one of them was to unite a church that had Jews and Gentiles in somewhat conflict there. And it's kind of funny that an epistle that was meant to unite a church has caused endless division and fights in the Christian church, whether it's in academia or in the pews or just among denominations. This letter seems to be a source of a lot of contention and a lot of heated debates because of a lot of the topics and themes that come in it. So, I wonder how Paul would think about this letter and its subsequent history beyond the original audience, given that. But it is an interesting letter. It's probably the most commented upon book of the Bible, at least of the New Testament. I mean, we have Leighton Flowers, who wrote a whole book, not on, the book of Romans, but on a chapter in Romans. So our friend Brian Abasciano has written 3 volumes on Romans 9 that are bigger than the 2-volume commentaries put out there by a lot of these authors writing on it. So it just seems to me that this book is kind of a big deal. What do y'all think?
I was told the other day that Romans is where small groups go to die. So,
well, Jonathan, is the book of Romans a systematic theology book?
Good day. Let's talk about that.
I'm teeing you up.
Yeah. Well, I don't think so, but we'll get into that when we get into the purpose of writing. But we'll talk about the author. We'll start there. with
Okay.
the author of the book of Romans because
Paul, done. Move on.
no, not that simple.
I'm for him. Yeah.
Yes, Paul, and one of the best things about Paul being the author is that it's not disputed, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
like almost nobody disputes that Paul wrote it. But we also know that Tertius was the amanuensis for it. He even says hello in the 16th chapter in the greetings. And so there's a discussion to be had about, did Paul dictate it? Was it kind of collaborative with him and the amanuensis? Did he kind of shorthand write it down and then go flesh it out later? Or did Paul just say, I want the gist, here's the gist, and then Tertius write the bulk of it? There's some discussion about that. I think the consensus of scholarship is that Paul probably dictated large portions of it, but because of the size of the letters, Paul's largest letter, he probably rehearsed various bits of it at different points in his preaching, probably with Phoebe and Tertius and others in his circle there. I believe that he was writing from Corinth. So I want to say I think Paul probably wrote the good bit of it, but I think because of the importance of what he was trying to accomplish with this letter, I think it was primarily dictated. But then you have to ask yourself the question, when it says, I, Tertius, say hello, wrote this out with my hand. I mean, it doesn't make sense to say that Paul dictated Tertius's own greeting to Tertius. So, I mean, you have to at least some of it, and that gets into interesting questions about inspiration, because people think, God inspired the text and inspired the authors, carried along by the Holy Spirit. And so was for like a brief flash there, Tertius himself inspired for one sentence. And how does that work? So, but I personally think that Paul probably dictated a large portion of it, but also got input, especially considering whatever context he had at Rome telling him about the situation probably helped fill him out. I don't know what you guys think. So that's why I had you on the show.
I mean, I think one thing is for certain is that we can't say that Paul did this willy-nilly, right? This isn't just like a one-off thing, because when you look at other, like Seneca, for example, apparently averaged like 995 words in his letters, who's a philosopher. Romans has 7,114. So there's a lot going on there. Plus, actually, I thought this was interesting. Scholar actually broke down that Romans would have on average cost about 20.68 denarii, which actually calculates to roughly $2,275 in the price of papyri.
Yeah, that's Keener, which was published before the Biden inflation. So
yeah, so Keener pointed that out, and I just thought that was kind of crazy, because clearly this was an expensive letter. So there was actually probably quite a bit of project going into this. It was something that was very premeditated and thought about.
Yeah, we've got the papyri. You've got it, whether Tertius donated his time or you have to pay for his services. Then there's you've got to transport it to Rome and probably pay for the performance there and the cost associated with that. But yeah, it's interesting, and it raises the question: was it worth the money? No, I'm just kidding. Of course, it was worth the money. Yeah, Braxton, you haven't moved the slide at all, by the way. There you go. Let them see what we're talking about here.
Jonathan, you're the one who's got to tell me to change the slide. It's your PowerPoint. I know that we're close to having some sort of a cognitive link, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, here we are on Trinity Radio, and for the first time, we're not in the same room because my room makes me look smarter. So I wanted to broadcast from here. But yeah, so we know that Paul was the author. Nobody disputes that. Tertius probably bounced some ideas off of, but it's probably mostly dictation, in my opinion. Now we can reconstruct Paul from biblical data. These are the historical bits of data that everyone knows. He was previously Saul. We know that he's a Roman citizen. We know that he was a Pharisee, tribe of Benjamin, trained in Jerusalem under Gamaliel. he persecuted the church, and he had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus that they placed somewhere in the early 30s. And he was commissioned. And that raises an interesting question: did he convert to an entirely new religion as a Jew, doing the fulfillment of Judaism, as we could say, with Jesus? Was it a calling? Was it both? That's an interesting thing that we might want to talk about. But we know that he was commissioned to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And we also know that he was not the founder of the Christian communities. So those are the bare facts that we know about Paul from the text. But that doesn't, it doesn't, the conversation, no, go back. The conversation doesn't.
See what happens? See?
because,
Yeah.
you know,
As your representative, I think you were right. In the
probably previously to the 70s, you could just introduce Paul and give this information in your commentary and say, yeah, Paul, and we know this about Paul, and here's some little facts about Paul. But you can't get away with that anymore, because I would say, at least since Saunders' publication of Paul and Palestinian Judaism, now we have this huge fight over, when you say Paul wrote the letter, what Paul are we talking about? Are we talking about the Catholic mystic Paul? Are we talking about the Lutheran Paul? Are we talking about the new perspective on Paul? Are we talking about this thoroughly Jewish Paul who didn't really change very much from his prior thinking? Do we talk about, you know, these new the apocalyptic Paul that Nick was supposed to come and represent? But we'll all have to try to carry the water on that one. So what Paul are we talking about? Which Paul do y'all think we're talking about?
Well,
go ahead, Em.
Sorry.
Oh, you
ahead,
go.
bro. Okay. Well, these conversations about what Paul we're talking about, they are very interesting to me. And you know, I was reading through Gorman's commentary on the Rome. He also, I think, a nice companion to go along with his Romans commentary is his book on Paul, and he talks about the different perspectives. But I don't think that we have to. I think some perspectives are not tenable. Like, I don't really rock with the traditional Lutheran or Calvinistic Paul like that. But I do think the apocalyptic Paul and the new perspective, and even a participationist perspective, has something going for it. So the question is, you know, when we're looking at Paul, we're asking ourselves, did he preach the same thing that Jesus preached? And also, did they both preach the same thing that the Old Testament prophets preached? And so I think that's where the different perspectives come in. And so rather than trying to center Paul in any one of the perspectives, I think the book of Romans is an eclectic letter, in terms that it does give us a systematic presentation. It can give us a systematic presentation, because I don't think that special revelation is the same thing as systematic theology. I think that we do theology, right? Human beings do theology. So I think that we can glean some systematic theology from it, but it was written on an occasion where we do see Paul also trying to bring Jews and Gentiles together, but he does address some of the finer points of what God had done through Christ in his interruption into human history, engaging the cosmic powers of death and sin and things like that. And of course, I just used two words there: the cosmic powers.
I do.
That's something that we see in the apocalyptic perspective. Of course, I'm gonna direct everybody to Nick's channel, but I think that the different perspectives also have implications for, the debates centering on predestination, election, things like that. And so, what Paul are we talking about? I think. Go ahead.
It's interesting. What I find in common between, like, the Catholic mystic Paul and the apocalyptic Paul is they both want to locate Romans 5 through 8 as like the locus of Pauline theology. But they go in different directions, because what the Catholic mystics find is the union with Christ being, and the experiential in Christness through the Holy Spirit, and that experiential aspect to be, that for those who are wondering what Christian spirituality and Christian mysticism is, and especially in the past and the Desert Fathers and all that, if you're wondering what that really is, Christian mysticism is basically just highlighting union with Christ and how they flesh that idea out. And of course, that's central to Catholic theology, because they lean heavily in that mystic tradition. They find a lot of connections in Romans 5, 6, and 7, 8 there. Now, what the apocalyptic Paul find in that same section is what MJ was talking about, where their critique of like a Lutheran Paul, which I'll kind of briefly flesh out in a minute, their critique of that is the Lutheran Paul is too truncated, it's too narrow in its scope, it's too much human centric, whereas what they're saying, the Christ event, the apocalypse of Jesus breaking into the world, that is upending the old order and a completely new thing. And this is not just about how does a human being as an individual find right standing with God, which is kind of the Lutheran thing. They think that Paul is just talking about, well, you have this guilt-ridden conscience like Luther did, and he read his existential crisis into Paul's letters, is how I put it. But basically, how can the individual sinner find grace from a holy God and all of that? Whereas the apocalyptic perspective says, no, this is a cosmic battle of good and evil, and it has all these powers, and Paul highlights this with the cosmic twin powers of sin and death, and the defeat of that, and new creation in breaking with the apocalypse of Jesus. And so they find in that same section, whereas Catholics kind of take this internal mysticism of union with Christ, they see this as outwardly cosmic, earth-shattering, cosmos-shattering. There's they just don't think that the other perspectives are, to use, just a turn of phrase, they don't think that the other versions of Paul are epic enough. They're not thinking grand enough in the scheme of what Paul has in his worldview as he's hashing these things out within the context of a letter like Romans. And then the new perspective, the new perspective on Paul kind of wants to push back on the Lutheran Paul, because the Lutheran Paul saw first century Judaism as kind of the proto-Catholicism, type of religion where you do enough works to save yourself. And when Sanders published Paul and Palestinian Judaism, he was saying, no, Judaism was also a religion based in grace. And it was by grace you enter the covenant, but it is by works that you demonstrate that you're a continued member of it. Kind of this phrase, covenantal nomism, is how they talk about it. And so they say you need to reinterpret Paul's discourse in Romans around what Paul would have understood Second Temple Judaism to be. The pushback on that is Second Temple Judaism was so variegated that there was that element of works righteousness, but how you understand that phrase, works versus faith, which we'll get into in the subsequent weeks, because that's going to be a big topic, is going to be determinative of how you hash those things out. And there's a lot of interpretive options that I don't think that the general audiences, especially in Protestant churches, are aware of. And I'm a good Baptist. And as Baptists, what I like to do is, even though I don't go to a quote unquote Baptist church, we're kind of Baptist. I haven't seen any infants baptized yet, but maybe they splash water on them. But
we're Baptist-costal.
Yeah. I think there's elements from all of them. And Baptists, we take from the theological buffet what we like and leave what we don't. And so that's kind of where I'm at.
Now, Jonathan, that was all very beautiful, but I have to ask now at this point, it only dawned on me, was this your way of tricking us all into one of your lectures here at Trinity? Is that what we've just signed up for?
No, I'm just trying to fill the air that y'all are leaving.
Is that right?
With the,
Are you sure?
Yeah. Oh, wait a second. I was just being polite.
No, we all should have known that's what was going to happen when Pritchett asked us to be part of something in New Testament theology.
I want you to bear witness to my commentary on Romans and add as little as Tertius did.
let me say this too.
You got it,
Dr. Pritchett. You're being challenged on Campbell, and it's being said that Campbell loves him some Romans 5:8, but he locates Paul's apocalyptic theology in Romans 1. You know who is challenging you.
Yeah, it's Nick. Yay. As if Campbell's the only APP guy, and we're not talking about DeBoer and all those other people too. Come on. I see, that's the thing. Not my apocalyptic Paul. Okay, Calvinist. Not my Calvinism.
But I mean, there are also other perspectives as well. You got the anti-imperialistic perspective, the Paul within Judaism perspective, the feminist perspective, and let me ask you a question, Pritchett. I don't know if you ran away. And when you were saying the Catholic mystic perspective, would that be the participationist perspective?
I mean, it would be some element of that, but the participationist seems to be more corporate, whereas the Catholic Church loves to talk about the one church, that we're the one true church, and they love to speak in corporate language. But Christian mysticism is highly individualistic insofar as it pertains to your personal experience and your union with Christ. Sure, that takes place within a larger body of the one holy apostolic church, blah, blah, blah. But still, they do put an emphasis more on the personal experience and the experience of communities, but it's really your union with Christ. And it's funny that you talk about the feminist Paul. Yeah, I mean, there's the liberal Paul, there's the homophobic bigot Paul, there's the liberationist Paul. I mean, there's all kinds of Pauls out there.
Yeah. I think what needs to be pointed out is the perspective of Paul that you take. And I'm not saying, I don't think this is a presuppositional issue. I think that we can empirically find out through inductive Bible study, and also looking at the socio-historical context, what Paul was getting at. But I think that when you look at what Paul is talking about, and I take a modified apocalyptic approach where salvation is about more than just people going to heaven. It's about more than I think when you make salvation or election about these preordained individuals going to heaven, it's a man-centered gospel right then and there. And number one, I think the gospel is bigger than that. When we look at Genesis 1, we look at the fall, we look at the impact of the fall. When we look at the solution, if the solution is just people going to heaven, why is the solution to the fall less impactful? I think that's something to think about.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things in Romans is that Paul seems to make clear is that he speaks of sin like a slave tyrant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with that, there's a lot more of this idea of like a cosmic tyrant and power that needs to be destroyed so that God can redeem not just his people, but his entire cosmos in a sense. I'm a fan of the New Perspective, although the New Perspective now is so freaking varied that it almost means nothing anymore. And it's not very new. I mean, it's like the 70s and 80s, so it's not really a new perspective. I have a lot of friends of mine. I have a lot of Torah observant friends, which is funny. So they take a thoroughly Jewish view of Paul, which has been an interesting thing to talk to them about. But I'm somewhere between the New Perspective and probably apocalyptic, at least in my view.
Yeah.
What about you, Leighton?
You stole my thunder because I was going to say about the same thing. I like some of the New Perspective on Paul. I tend to agree with most of what I read from N.T. Wright. But I think that, and that's the thing. It's just like with the atonement theories and some of these all the different debate theories. It's like it's either this one or it's this one or it's this one or it's this one, and people get siloed into one particular group or camp. When the truth of the matter is, there's truth in probably all of them to some degree. Now, the bigot Paul or something like that, throw some of those out, but there's some probably truth in all of the different perspectives. And it's kind of almost the buffet style of give and take. Yeah, this is a good point here, and this is a good point here, and this is where we see, when he's talking about these particular subjects, there's some value there. And so, yeah, I don't think there's just one particular, view of Paul that captures all aspects of who Paul is. Just like all of us, when we get labeled based upon a particular view we have or a particular thing we're discussing in one particular area. It's easy to pigeonhole us in a particular way of thinking, but I think there's some value in especially the new perspective on Paul's. I kind of side there a lot, and in a lot of what he says, a lot of the conclusions he comes to seems to be much more in line with what I'm reading from Paul and how I'm understanding what Paul's intentions are, because he's really going back to a New Testament, first century Jewish mindset in the way that the average, reader of that day would have understood Paul's teachings.
Well, to your point, though, I have the benefit of ignorance of some of this, but on the other hand, you were talking about each person is a dynamic of a lot of different of those things. If anybody in this table were to write your magnum opus and express your theology, well, you're coming from a lot of different vantage points. You have your own salvation experience. You probably, at least a few of you, have some mysticism, and we're trying to get that into the Baptist around here. I mean, I have some mysticism in me and experiences. I'm not comfortable with the fact that the evangelist and church planter strategic thinker Paul is not included in some of these, because that's who he was. It was his identity. He said, I wanted to come to you guys because I wanted to impart a spiritual gift. And he talks out, he was a missionary is what he was. He was the premier missionary going around traveling, and church planter and contextualizer. And so he would have been thinking in those terms. He's talking about going on to Spain and all the rest. And so to leave that out, I think, is to leave out a large chunk of what he's really getting at and why he's talking the way he is. Because I know there's one school of thought is say he was thinking as Rome as maybe establishing it as a new missions base, his next Antioch. I don't know if it's true or not, but I mean, it's certainly worth doing that. But I'm uncomfortable with pigeonholing. Oh, it's the mystic Paul. Okay,
well, one of the things that I like about being a Baptist, and one of the things that you'll find in some of the later commentaries, is because each of these camps are bringing out certain elements that others can be okay with, it's kind of one of those situations where you're clapping with one hand, because you're like, I can clap at the things that I can amen. It's this other stuff that you're trying to also say goes along with that I can't go along with. So what you find is a lot of yes, but, and then they go off, yes, I like that, but not this. And so you find a lot of that qualifying everything. It's like, I can go, I appreciate you bringing out this stuff. I can clap at that, but I can't clap at this other stuff because you're taking it too far in another direction. And so you find a lot of that happening in the commentaries, because one of the biggest breakthroughs, I think, of the new perspective on Paul is even like some of the diehard Reformed commentators, like the Reformed Baptists who can't be moved on anything. You can read Thomas Schreiner's commentary, and he's like, I mean, yeah, they've given us some helpful insights, and we have to account for those, but not too much, But
Jonathan, I think the first step of the new perspective on Paul, or the Old Testament type stuff, the stuff you're talking about with grace in the Old Testament, all that sort of thing, that all can make sense to me. That paradigm works. When we get into the second half or the second part of it, and we're looking at the book of Romans and things like that, and how does all of this exactly cash out with the different doctrines that we discuss in Romans, imputation and all that sort of thing. That when it gets into these analogies, you've heard me argue with you about this over and over again.
Like with imputation.
At some point, I said imputation. At some point, we get to this point where it's like, It just seems like we're arguing about which analogy is the best analogy to fit the theological issue that we're trying to describe. And even William Lane Craig, when we were in Israel, told me, "Oh no, Braxton, it's so much more than that." But I find myself still
when your eyes aren't glazing over.
yeah, that's right. That's right. But then the second thing I want to say is whatever you want to say about this. I know there's a lot of talk about no, Romans is not a systematic theology. That wasn't the point. He didn't sit down and try to write a systematic theology,
or did he?
All right, that's the question. But I know you would want to say no, he didn't. But the fact is, but yeah, here's the yeah, but the yeah, but is what I mentioned to you yesterday, Jonathan, which is whether that was his intent or not. He certainly did do what appears to be a fair amount of systematic theology in the midst of what he was doing. And so you get that.
Yeah, it comes. That's a part of the discussions around Paul that I guess is two helpful spectrums for people to think about in the audience that are brought up. And Brett brought this out. Missional minded evangelism. How much of Paul's theology versus sociology is going on in Paul's letters? There's a spectrum there, and how much of the theology is in service to his sociological projects, or vice versa. And that goes a long way into trying to figure out how do we read what Paul says. And then the other spectrum between theology and sociology is Paul and Judaism. Where is he on the spectrum of, how do you understand the relationship between law and gospel, law and grace, and all of that stuff? And where's Paul on that? So people are going to find themselves in these various conversations on closer to one end of the spectrum or the other. And so those are things to keep in mind. And how can you carry through that consistently from text to text? And one of the things that we remember in hermeneutics is, the authorial intent matters. Everybody agrees with what the text says. We all agree what the Bible says. I don't care if you're new perspective, old perspective, Catholic perspective, whatever. I mean, we're going to talk about some textual issues as we go along and talk about the unity, integrity of Romans itself here in a minute. But we all agree on our received text. We all agree what it says, but we all differ on what it means. And in hermeneutics, we talk about a text. What the author intended to communicate is where the authority of its meaning lies, right? The authorial intent. But I want to go a step further than that, because when you have something like a letter essay or a speech sandwiched into an epistle or whatever you want to call Romans, the intent for what he wrote it for to accomplish matters as much as the intent and what he meant and what he wrote to accomplish it. So finding out the purposes behind Paul's letter goes a long way in understanding his intent and the words that he used to accomplish that purpose. So it's not just authorial intent in the words themselves, but it's overall his aims, what was the telos of Paul with any given epistle. Sometimes he tells us, sometimes in longer works, it's harder to tease those things out. So we have to keep that in mind. And one of the things about producing a book with long introductions and commentaries is sometimes in a commentary, because people have their own agendas, they forget everything that wherever they landed in the introduction, and they don't carry it all the way through the book. But commentators now are having to be mindful of this and say, if you're going to plant your flag in the introduction somewhere, you need to be able to flesh that out from text to text to text, and not get excited about chapters 3, chapters 8, chapters 9, and then kind of waffle on and not give as much attention, because your text might be a hobby horse passage in one chapter or another, and negate or neglect with undue attention going over every word, because we can all pay lip service to every word is in the Bible is important. But I mean, how often are you sitting around reading 1 Chronicles chapter 2, a bunch of names, and poring over that? Not much.
Hey, Jonathan.
Yeah.
We've got like several slides, and we're on the first one.
I know.
Do you want to move forward?
Yeah, the rest are pretty quick.
Okay. That's why I tell people when I preach, I'm like, the rest of my points are a lot quicker than the first one.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, there's several possibilities. Some people go with early 50s, as early as 54. I don't think that's plausible. A lot of commentators kind of in that 55 to 58 date range, and they tend towards the latter, because they want to put Paul writing this letter. Just if you kind of position it next to Acts, just real quickly, they put him either that 3-month winter break in Corinth, most likely, but some people say Synchre, but probably Corinth, and they would have put that kind of 57, 58, and I think that's probably the best guess. But
BW3 says 56 to 57.
Yeah.
Ben Witherington III. There's a episode that's a lost episode of Trinity Radio that you can now get if you're a patron. By the way, we'd love for you to be a patron at patreon.com/Trinity Radio, where you can get ebooks, audiobooks, previous episodes, and a lecture hall with about 7 8-hour courses on various apologetics issues with yours truly, as well as a course on the resurrection and one on Calvinism from Jonathan Pritchett. So, and one of the episodes that's missing is an episode where we respond to BW3. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah. So there's some dispute earlier than that. I don't really go for an earlier date. I'm kind of lean towards the 57, 58 dates, but I don't know where you guys. I don't know if y'all even care.
I have no opinion about this.
Just take an average. Yeah.
I would say between 55 and 58.
Yeah.
It would. I don't know how Campbell gets to the early 50s though, because that would have been during the time that the Jews were kicked out, right? I mean, that was between 49 and 54 that the Jews all had to get pushed out.
Well, the edict was in 49. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. The second edict, Claudius's edict, was they could try to place that around 49. And part of the reason is for there to be, we're kind of jumping ahead on that, but yeah, I would think there would be more time.
We can wait. Yeah, I just the only one that didn't make sense to me is the early 50s. It seemed to have to be after they came back to Rome, which would have been in 54.
Yeah. Jamie, I guarantee you that we will not do this episode on Romans 9 when we get there in 150 years at the rate we're going. But we will definitely have Leighton for Romans 9, at least one of the probably 20 episodes we'll have to do on it. But yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
All right, Braxton, you may go to the next slide.
Thank you. I need to be told. I like rules. I like laws. I would be a great legalist because I like for people to tell me what I need to do so that I can be pleasing to to everybody else. It's I'd make a great legalist because just need to know that if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm a good husband. I'm a good child of God. And unfortunately, sometimes it gets more subjective than that.
Yeah. Well, the audience, of course, there's some debate about this. I think it was like in the 1800s, there was popular to think that this was a mostly Jewish audience for some reason, but that's like almost nobody thinks that today. But there are questions like Ben Witherington III, BW3, as Braxton affectionately calls him, one of our favorite guys. I mean, he's like overwhelmingly it's a Gentile audience, but Paul's happy for the 10 to 15% Jewish audience to listen in on this conversation. I don't go with that personally. I definitely don't go with the mostly Jewish, but I do go with a more heavily Gentile, but there's still got to be a sizable Jewish minority. So I'm kind of with Fitzmyer, who's a Catholic commentator, and James G.D. Dunn on that. Yeah, but see, the layman seminary says mostly Gentiles, the Jews are returning, but that's the thing. In order for there to have been a conflict in Rome, where Paul doesn't say the church at Rome, in order for there to be a conflict that needs a letter as enormous as Romans, as heavily. Now I know that it's easy to think that Jews probably started the church initially before they were kicked out. I don't know about that, but I think for the conflict to require such a sizable letter, I think it's got to be a little bit more, which is why I go with Leighton on the later date, that more had time to filter back to Rome from the edict, because it just seems like there's so much Jewish issues that Paul's trying to walk that tightrope between honoring the Old Testament and then telling them to go back to just say that it's overwhelmingly Gentile, because if the Jewish congregations, wherever they were in the city, were so small to be insignificant, I don't know that would require as much. I mean, look at Galatians. That's kind of a letter where you've got the Judaizers making a whole bunch of noise. That's a serious situation. And whenever the party from James showed up in Antioch, they were sizable there for Peter to get called out by Paul there. And so you have all these places where it made a difference between the Jews and Gentiles to cause kerfluffles. It didn't take as much to explain as the letter of Romans. Now, the flip side of that is, if they were very small, Paul's going out of his way and overboard to write this letter because he didn't want to beat up on the Jews, the tiny Jewish minority. But I don't think that works. So,
well, I think you put it perfectly, because I think the mostly Gentiles with sizable Jewish minority is probably the view that is the most sensible, because there's also so much Old Testament callback throughout the entire book and letter of Romans that you can't really get past it in my mind, because there had to be a group of people there that understood a lot of these references. Because if you're a new convert, maybe, I mean, it's possible they could have been God-fearers, I guess, who attended a synagogue, but that were Gentiles. But really, a lot of that understanding that was going to have to be imported in was going to probably be from a Jewish audience, at least in my mind.
Well, Brian Abasciano in his dissertation, and I guess this portion may have made it into the book form for his Romans 9, 1-9 book. I mean, he makes the argument, I think he makes a compelling case, that Gentile believers would have started getting training in the Old Testament because that was their Bible at the time as well. So it's fair enough that they would get a lot of the highlights that Paul would have had. But that would have also came from Jewish instruction, or Jewish convert instruction as well. So if they disappeared, we don't know how much of that they could have had. I mean, if you put the origin of the church in Rome sometime in the 30s, maybe the transients from Pentecost or wherever, I mean, it's a very transient city anyway. But it certainly would have probably been Jews who started that church. And so they would have taught the God-fearers and the Gentile converts in the Old Testament. So I mean, they would have familiarity with that, but I don't think they would have had familiarity with the issues if they were so overwhelming in numbers compared to the Jewish community, that Paul's statements about that and with his diatribe and interlocutors, that it would warrant that kind of response. So,
amen.
I go with it's a majority Gentile, but I mean, I would put it more 25-30%. I mean, we can't know for sure. This is all speculation, but I mean, just given how much of attention he's paying to this, it just seems to me, if you have Jews in Antioch, you have Jews in Galatia, and you have Jews in the diaspora and Gentiles there, and it's Paul's going on about this and those kinds of numbers. And of course, Paul's going out of his way first to the Jew and the Greek, the apostle to the Gentiles, always going to synagogues first. I mean, we find that in Acts. That's just the way he operated. So I don't know. I don't go with that. But just to get some background on Rome, there seems to be, according to Judas Maccabee, Jews had been going to and from Jerusalem and back to Rome since as early as 160 BC. In 139 BC, Hispalus expelled the Jews. That's expulsion number 1, because they were contaminating Roman customs. By the 1st century, the estimates were between 20,000 and 50,000 Jews in Rome. Pompey, back in 63 BC, had brought a lot of slaves from his warring. In the east, he brought back Jews, but they were freed by 59 BC. Tiberius in 1980, he ordered the Jews to leave Rome, though I think some were conscripted in the military, but this wasn't thought to be too successful of an expulsion, because the Herodian family kept their close ties with the imperial household. So they don't think that a large number of Jews would have left in 19. Then, of course, you had another expulsion, Claudius following after that. He initially expanded the rights of the Jews, but he told them they couldn't congregate, just because they didn't want too much of that pollution, because apparently Judaism became a cosmopolitan religion for some of the wealthier people, especially for women, and it was attractive to slaves as well. But then again, in 49, Claudius kicks them out, which we had talked about. And Suetonius talks about that being over Christus, which most people take as his mispronunciation of Christus, even though this is a common name. The best guess was in the synagogues, you've got probably Christian converts from Judaism and Jews in the synagogues causing this big kerfluffle over Jesus.
Over the identity of the Messiah, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so he orders them to go, but a lot of people take that as like not necessarily every Jew was expelled from that expulsion, but a lot of them were. But probably the Roman citizens never did leave, but a good number of them did. We know that Priscilla and Aquila left, for example, and they met up with Paul in Ephesus. So you have that.
Jonathan, I wanted to throw in there real quick that because you mentioned this Christus thing, that as an apologetic point, if anyone wants a good resource on Jesus outside of the New Testament, there's a great book called Jesus Outside the New Testament by Robert Van Voorst, and goes through all of this stuff and the cases for and against this being presumed to be that we're talking about Christ here and all those kind of things. I just wanted to recommend that. That's Jesus Outside the New Testament by Robert Van Voorst. And now Jonathan has disappeared. Does anyone want to take a chance to say anything? Does anyone want to talk about anything real quick?
Yeah, our leader's gone.
I think that they're reading comments at this point.
Right. Okay.
That's what's going on.
Yeah.
All right, Jonathan, did you get the last bullet point here?
Yeah, I mean, basically, we don't know the exact origins of the church, but we do. But people could say it was Jews and Gentiles traveling to and from Rome and establishing Christian communities there. I do think that the hypothesis that some of them may have been from Pentecost is probably valid, and I also think that the Jewish congregations and the Gentile congregations probably established themselves in a rather large city. I think that they put the estimate at between 250,000 to 400,000 people at the time, maybe even more. Some estimates are higher, as high as 1 million I've seen, but I don't know. But those congregations probably developed and formed independently of one another. And that might also be even before 49, when they were the Jews were expelled, that probably coming up separately. It would be like a Methodist church and a Baptist church forming in a town somewhere, but they never interact with each other except for the Baptist duck in the liquor store, so they don't get seen. But I mean, it's kind of like they just kind of came up together and they had their own kind of way of being Christian with respect to Torah, depending on how they were initiated and converted into Christianity.
I got a question for you.
Hold on just a second, MJ.
Okay.
Reverton, I don't know. I need to be careful because sometimes people try to trick me into saying bad words with how they write their name. But I think this one's okay. And thank you for that super chat. It says, took some moxie to roll straight into a very dense presentation after getting our blood boiling with all that controversy. Go off, JP.
That's how we do it.
And this is particularly interesting because I think it may be that Reverton got into it with one of our mods a second ago. If not, and I'm seeing that wrong, I'm sorry. We're using a new presentation thing tonight from what we usually use, and I'm new to it. But thank you so much for that.
Yeah, but given that background helps us understand the situation on the ground by the time of the first century, let us know whatever proportions you give to Jews and Gentiles, it's going to matter as you go through the text where how you read Paul on how he stands with respect to the law and gospel.
So let me ask you this, because we were talking about, I know we can't get into percentages, but with all of that evidence that you just laid out, would it be okay to come to the conclusion that upon the death of Claudius and the return of the Jews to Rome, that the church that they returned to was kind of sort of dominated by Gentiles? Could that be the case?
Oh, that's definitely, yeah, I definitely think that's the case. I put the Gentiles as a majority, just saying that I don't think it was so minuscule, like 10 to 15%. I'd say 25, 30%. But as they rolled back in, you've got, let's say that they started rolling back in under Nero, 54, 55. It could just be that Nero thought, Nero pulled the Biden, like started overturning all of Trump's orders just because
he just compared Nero to Biden.
Yes. Biden signs a bunch of executive orders to countermand the executive orders that Trump had signed. He just kind of got rid of all of them. And, that's kind of what happened with Newsy. I think there's a way to read this to where the reason why Nero ditched a lot of these edicts from Claudius is because he thought it was a moron.
Well, Jonathan, real quick, I think it could be like a good idea to like get this take. So we are right now in a country that is basically, very close to two countries, and yet pastors have to get in the pulpit every week and try to preach to two crowds that have two very different outlooks and backgrounds. Now, the Jewish and Gentile Christians, they obviously are pressing toward unity in Christ, but it might be good to hear from Pastor Brett, like when you think through like preaching to a Jewish and Gentile audience, I would think that you have to be like a genius pastor to try and navigate that.
Well, they would be in different house churches though.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're going one to the other. We don't mix the Jews with the Gentiles. That's what you're saying.
Well, I can't say for sure. I would think that you would have some Gentiles in some of the Jewish house churches and some Jewish converts to Christianity in some of the Gentile churches. But we're looking at probably 13 or so at the time of Paul, at least. So they would I don't know what their makeups would be individually.
13 or so what, churches?
Yeah, like congregations. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, what would you do if this coming Sunday you had?
Well, I think when you put all the data together, in my view, and is that I believe what he's doing when you incorporate his statements in the first chapter where he says, "I've been longing to go there," and he views himself, he is an apostle. That's his identity. He's a church planter. He's a missionary. He's a contextualizer. He's a strategic thinker. He wanted to go to Rome. And because it was the place, and it was the place from which everything would just, the gospel itself would spread from there. And he knew that you think about it, for the last 20 years, that is the issue. The biggest issue of all is the Jew-Gentile thing. That's what he's always arguing about. Now, when he writes Galatians, he's writing as a pastor and he's putting out fires. And that's how he talks. He's what the heck is going on? What are you thinking? That kind of stuff. Here, he's not planted that church. He's not the direct pastor of it. And I think what he's doing is taking all of his experience that he's had with that debate, with that argument, and no one knows it better than him. The cross-section of his heart, he's the Jew of Jews, but the apostle of the Gentiles. So no one's thought about this stuff more than him. And so he's presenting to them, this is in effect the solution to this ongoing debate and struggle. Because if you're a Jew in those days, it would have been really, really super difficult, even if you did accept Christ and walked with him, to process all of that. What does that mean for my Judaism? In the same way for a Gentile. And you had some Jews that said, forget that, I'm going to go straight that way. And so I think he's, throughout the whole book, he's walking this Gentile Jew thing and trying to put it all together. So he's being a unifier, and I think that's why he's taking the time. I think you're getting his 20 years of reflections and debates and pushback and the FAQs he's done and all that kind of stuff in one big thing. And I think that's what you would have. You would I'm aware of this situation and how everybody's struggling. And I think he's kind of sending that ahead. So he doesn't whenever he arrives, he doesn't have to go into all that. He's just kind of saying, this is who I am. And this is, I think that's the solution to the struggles that was the ongoing debate for all these people all the time, I would think. That's why he gets in the stuff at the end and all the rest.
Yeah.
But that's just me. But how I would do that, I think you have to have a lot of sensitivity to it. When you go into, it's a contextualized thing. When you go to, we did work in New York City, and well, I got to preach in New York City. Well, it's a little different in Midtown Manhattan. Preaching there as Evansville, Indiana. There are, and I talked to the guy there and talked about the issues and the problems and the background and the education levels, everything. It's what are they dealing with? And I had to kind of craft who I am. And Paul was a contextualizer. That's throughout the book of Acts, over and over and over again with the different audiences and things. And I think of Romans as a contextualized letter to their situation.
I think you're exactly right. And Paul is also, he's known to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And so he's become the Gentile apologist, so to speak, in the sense that he's the Jew that's making an argument for the inclusion of Gentiles. And so no matter who he's writing to and the percentage of numbers that are there, I think he's always going to lean towards the inclusion of the Gentiles and defense of the Gentiles. You see that obviously throughout Romans, where he's using that interlocutor who's in his mind usually a Jew, combating his theology.
Yeah, until chapter 11, he's always arguing with it. I take the position that he's always arguing with, and that's going to matter when we get into.
He's always arguing with what?
Up until chapter 11, his interlocutor is always Jewish, but I mean, as we go through the book of Romans, we'll have to have those discussions about who the identity of the interlocutor at any given point. And I think because people don't identify that interlocutor from the perspective of the interlocutor, they go wrong on a lot of texts, and they don't see Paul's pattern in dealing with it. Speaking of Romans 9, I know this is a chapter very near and dear to Leighton Flowers' heart.
That's the Calvinist chapter, in case anybody doesn't know.
Yeah,
it's all about Calvinism.
That's the book. That's the chapter. The Armenian
not the Calvinist
chapter.
Right?
But when you get to the interlocutor, Paul has never once conceded a single inch of ground with his interlocutor. And the way I read Romans 9, 19, and 20, that Paul still doesn't. when he shuts down the "Who are you, O man?" to answer back to God, he's not responding to the Pelagian Armenian weenie who's mad that in eternity past God picked winners and losers, because that's not really what Paul's talking about. So
Leighton Flowers is not the interlocutor for Paul in Romans 9.
Yeah, I mean, because the only time Paul actually agrees with his interlocutor is when it's the Gentile, and he says, you can say that branches were broken off so that I could be great. And he says, true enough, but then he tells him to not get arrogant. So he kind of agrees, but then qualifies his agreement by don't get arrogant because you could get broken off too.
And by the way, I just want to stick in here real quick that we have a discussion of Romans 9 with Leighton Flowers on this channel from just a couple of weeks ago in response to Christy Burke, who is an atheist YouTuber and TikToker. So if you just can't wait to get to the Romans 9 content, you can go there, or you can go to probably put your finger randomly, do the Magic 8 Ball with Leighton Flowers' YouTube channel, and you can probably get something on Romans 9.
Yeah.
Or if you just want to see Christy Burke get debunked, the Church Split has a 1 and 2 parter that we just uploaded.
Oh man.
Hey, we did one of those on One Life Network too. Everybody's
Christy Burke.
That's right.
I wonder
Christy Burke, her thing on morals. Yeah.
If Christy Burke didn't bloviate a bunch of nonsense, there wouldn't be so many videos of her. But here we go.
Right.
Wes, I wonder if Christy Burke, because surely she'll have watched an hour and 40 minutes and 12 seconds of this podcast to hear this so that she can.
Yeah. Hi, Christy.
Yeah. So she can respond.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Jonathan, we blew you off, but here we are on purpose.
Yeah.
Purpose.
Here's where it gets fun, because these are, I mean, people have given more, but I tried to group these up into like the main things. And of course it goes without saying, you can, with a letter this large, you can have a bunch of different goals you want to accomplish with one thing, right? That's not, I mean, we do that with our presentations when we go speak in front of anybody. So, but what is the main thing, and how would you have all these options out? Because for a good chunk of church history, people thought that this was Paul just laying down a presentation or kind of a synthesis of his universal Christian doctrines. The problem with that is he doesn't really go into the resurrection like he does in 1 Corinthians. He doesn't talk about the Lord's Supper, and various key places in the letter of Romans. He's also appealing to traditions that predated him that, he doesn't really highlight elsewhere in his theology. Like the phrase justified by the blood is in Romans 3 is thought to be a prior tradition to Paul. He's just kind of appealing to that. Be recognizable to his Gentile audience because he doesn't know them. So it seems like if it was an attempt to systematize all of his doctrines, key Pauline doctrines are not even here, or at least expounded upon to any depth whatsoever. So
it'd be like Tim Stratton writing what his whole worldview is, and then he doesn't say anything about free will. Or the free will argument, we could say.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I say it's a contextualized document. I mean, it is. I think it's from Unify the Jew and Gentile churches down is where I am.
I don't know this. People say obtain support for Jerusalem, which, I mean, he was going to go there before he went to Rome. So he wasn't trying to, I don't know. It seems like they would have already had close ties. So I don't buy that. But they think that this was on his way to when he was going to go to Jerusalem before heading out to Rome. His thing was, some would argue that Romans was a dress rehearsal for how he was going to present his gospel there when he delivered his offering to them. But the problem with that, though, is, I mean, they've already had the Jerusalem Council by this point. So, I mean, what does he still need to work out? Because we also know from Acts, though, when he does get to Jerusalem, it kind of goes bad, right? I mean, riot breaks out in the temple and all of that. You can read in Acts. So, I mean, maybe he was trying to defend himself, because he defends himself a lot in the book of Romans, not quite to the degree as he does. He defends his ministry in 2 Corinthians and in the first chapter of Philippians. He talks about all that he's been through and suffered for Christ and stuff. So, I mean, but I don't know that that's really plausible. The next one would be to establish authority of a majority Gentile church or group of churches that he wasn't the founder of. He probably thought he had a sense as the apostle to the Gentiles that he wanted to kind of establish himself as authoritative over them. But I don't see him being as pushy and ornery as he normally is in other epistles. So,
well, even there, you have, is it 1 Corinthians where he's like, I told Apollos to come to you, but he said he didn't want to, or something. And it's like, you would expect from Paul, you got none less than the Apostle Paul to drop some authority there and be like, no, dadgummit, you're going to go. But we don't see that. So,
right. I mean, he Paul's very strategic, and when he's trying to shove his weight around, right? So, but then we have the unity of the Jew and Gentile congregations in Rome as his primary purpose in writing this. And so all of his theological discussions of redemptive history and Jews and Gentiles and God justifying the man regardless of being Jew and Gentile, all that is in service to bringing these two, the weak and the strong, if you want to get to chapter 14, or the Jew Gentile, get these to come together and unify. Some just think it's an accommodation just to introduce himself, just to ingratiate himself to them. Part of it is to defend against Jewish objections, but I think that's part of Jewish objections more so to Paul personally, because he kind of goes that route, to defend his thing. And then there's I don't know why, to obtain support for the mission to Spain. And Robert Jewett, I mean, he goes all in on this. He thinks that hence the thumb statement that Paul was trying to get support for Spain. And the whole reason for this letter is that was number 1, number 2, number 3 on his list. And to unify the two congregations had to happen for him to be able to get his support from them to go to Spain.
Jonathan, did we get an hour and 46 minutes into this stream before we justified the thumbnail? Is that what just happened? The thumbnail was Paul just in it for the money? And here we are at an hour 46 and we get the answer.
Well, I mean, he went around it. I mean, people like to say that he,
right there.
He was the tent maker, but he did that in Corinth for specific reasons. Paul had patrons. Jesus had patrons. I mean, they have patrons.
Well, for the standards of my videos, an hour 46 is only about, the first 10% of my videos. So yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
I'm inspired. I'm taking a whole new tactic.
Yeah. And then as Brian Abasciano says in his dissertation, and as in Thomas Schreiner's commentary that you could probably see on the table behind me.
Oh yeah, I've been noticing that.
He said that Paul wrote Romans to glorify God. I mean, that's the same reason Spurgeon.
And you're not allowed to say no to that. Well,
yeah.
Of course.
I mean, Spurgeon spoke for the same reason, but I mean, I think that's nice to say that, but
how long
it really doesn't give us anything about Romans itself, because Paul wrote every epistle to glorify God.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the thing. I mean,
yeah, but I mean, true to form, he's a Reformed Baptist. He has to be pious, and
yeah, there you go.
Well, he was,
and he was, but in all of that, like I said, I think other than Jewett's commentary, who's like, no, it's everything has to do with the Spain mission. I think that's a part of it.
But Jonathan, what I've been wondering is, why is Romans 16:25 through 27 mobile?
Because it shows up in 6 different places in the manuscript tradition.
Well, tell us about it, or kick it out for someone else to tell us about it.
Well, I didn't know that y'all had finished telling me why. I know what Brett thinks. Brett's all of the above from unifying the church on down, but
yeah. Go ahead.
MJ, he was unifying the church around his mission. You can't just pick one. I mean,
yeah,
I'm with Brett on this one.
For heaven's sakes.
MJ, were you going to speak?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing to say is to take an eclectic approach. That Paul is presenting a theological treatise, and the reason why he's presenting a theological treatise, it comes out as he's dealing with the Jewish Gentile conflict, and so he has to present a presentation of what God has revealed from heaven, and how we are one in Christ, and how we've been united in Christ and raised to new life, how we've been crucified with Christ, raised to new life. You go to Romans 7, just so that nobody's confused. He says, I'm now talking to those who know the law. He's talking to the Jews, and he's vindicating the law and its epistemological functions. Going into Romans 8, talking about those whom he foreknew. I think he's talking about Old Testament saints. I don't think that he's getting into metaphysics, as some would believe, because I mean, how would the audience know who those who he foreknew, unless we're talking about Old Testament saints? And then in Romans 8, he says, if you suffer with me, you'll reign with me. So that's kind of conditional as well. And then getting into Romans 9, getting into some more Old Testament stuff as well. And of course, he's taking care of pastoral concerns in the latter chapters. So I do think that the purpose, the main purpose, is to solidify that bond within the church. But of course, you can address each of these. You can garner support for Spain. You can. He has to introduce himself if he's going to address this. So yeah. But I think the primary purpose is to build unity. And of course, unity is built up on the solid foundation of God's revelation. So he does give a theological.
That's a big word.
And all the above.
Well, let's consider Spain for a second, though. We go the extra mile, even if we're an hour and 50 minutes in this. Spain at the time had a few centers, but it was still, in the West, still somewhat resistance to a lot of Roman influence. I mean, there was some centers there, but sparsely populated. At the time, the best I understand it, it was mostly Latin speaking or native dialects, which meant that to establish unity in Rome, he would need a lot of resources as a base of operations, because to go to Spain, he would need connections there, because also there was a language barrier that had to be overcome because it had to be translated, and he would need someone. We don't know Paul's understanding of Latin, probably, not much. So he would probably need that translation to Latin, and then from Latin to the native tongues out there in Spain at the time. So that's going to require a lot of effort and a lot of support that his entourage probably doesn't have, because he hasn't been out there yet. Because the whole reason he wants to go is because he wants to go where the gospel hasn't been proclaimed. He says he's not interested in building on another's foundation, but go where the name of Jesus isn't heard yet. And so, I mean, he says that in the letter. And so the logistics of that, the financial support that he'd need, the overcoming the translation barrier, the patronage he'd need for him and his entourage out there, contacts. Paul's modus operandi is to go to the synagogues first, and then to the Gentiles, and try to establish connections in the synagogues. But there was almost no Jewish presence in Spain at the time in the first century, so he didn't have those typical advantages that he was used to on his mission. So getting unity from this church for the purpose of the Spanish mission was vital. So that's why he might have been in it for the money a little bit, because I don't think that the Spanish mission could have been possible if he did not establish the connections with a unified church. So we can't just kind of put, he wants to be a missionary because, Paul, he's the apostle to the Gentiles and he had such a heart. Yeah, but there's logistical things, practical things that need to be in place for him. And of course, you got to think about the Church of Rome. He's trying to introduce himself. They've probably heard, this is the guy, wherever he goes, they start riots. He's already answering slanderous claims from chapter 3 on against him, right? So what do the Romans think of Paul? He's a guy that starts riots everywhere he goes. He probably a lot of misconceptions about how he feels about Judaism. When he made it to Jerusalem, I mean, James told him, hey, you need to go do some, to the Jews, I become like the Jew, and to the Greeks, I become like the Greek. Well, you need to be more Jewish now. You need to go do this stuff, right? And then all of a sudden, chaos ensues. So these people in Rome have a reason to be somewhat suspicious of Paul and his reputation, given the rumors about him and his gospel, given what the perception is of how he sits towards Judaism. There's a lot there going on.
Imagine what we would have if Paul had written more letters to churches that he had not been to, because I think one of the reasons he was so thorough is because he hadn't been to Rome, and he was teaching them a lot of things he didn't get a chance to teach, possibly the churches that he helped to plant. He was able to be there and teach them. So I think the reason we were blessed with the letter to the Romans was because he wasn't there and gave them so much more. And so it makes you wonder, had he written to some other churches that he hadn't been to, how much more we would have gotten from Paul as far as his theology.
We have Colossians. I mean, he wasn't the founder of that church.
Well, yeah.
Which
not near as thorough there.
Yeah. But see, that's the interesting thing, because Colossians is another letter like Romans that has not nearly as long as Romans, but it has the same say hi to every name you can think of, which, I mean, Romans 16 is a chapter that greet as many people as he can name off the top of his head. But there are some textual issues here that that really Nick wanted to talk about. But there's several different manuscripts, and the earliest one I think is P46. But all of them, about 6 different ways that you can hash out Romans that have this doxology moved in various places. One of them would have it right after chapter 14, verse 23, and then it adds the chapter 16, verse 24, then 25 through 27. And then you have one after chapter 15, right? So you have a version of Romans that ends at 14. You have one that ends at 15. You have one that has the whole book. So it's kind of tricky there. Then there's the added thing that some of the early manuscripts don't even say in Rome, which has led some people to think that one of the truncated versions that also has in Rome means that this was not even originally written to Rome, but it was adapted for the situation at Rome. And that goes back to making the case that it was, in fact, a theological treatise and not handling a specific situation that he later kind of formulated for Rome. The names in chapter 16, a lot of connections with Ephesus, and they say, well, in Acts, we last left Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus. So how do we know they went back to Rome? Well, that's an argument from silence, but did they go back to Rome? Right. So was this originally intended for Rome or not? Then you have in 1620 and 1624, sometimes they omit verse 20, but it's that grace of the Lord be with you is kind of seems like somewhat of an ending. And then they just kind of move it around. So there's textual issues there that actually do call into question some of, it goes back to what I said at the beginning in hermeneutics. The authorial intent helps us understand not just the words, but the whole purpose behind the words is what he was intending to accomplish with all the words that he used. So that calls into question. I don't know, Braxton left us, but if we can go to the next slide whenever he gets back. But anyway, I don't know if people were aware of these issues, but some of these things are why people come to different conclusions, or at least in the history of all the commentaries. So if you want to go with the shortest version of Romans, of course, it was argued that this was the original letter of Paul it was an encyclical letter that Paul sent around to all the churches that he wasn't the founder of. And then later he would add things like in Rome, or he would add chapters 15 and 16 for various reasons. Now, the arguments for this is that Origen mentions in his commentary, Marcion dropped the doxology and everything after chapter 14. And of course, Irenaeus, Cyprian, and Tertullian never quote chapters 15 and 16, but they may not have had the occasion to. So against this idea is that because Romans 14:23 is an odd place to end a letter, and then maybe tack on a doxology as some of the manuscripts of 16, 25 through 27, it doesn't seem like that makes much sense, because the argument continues all the way to chapter 15, verse 6. So you're kind of cutting off the tail end of that argument. The personal details in Romans chapter 1, 8 through 13 is not very general. So they're thinking this was probably Marcion's doing for this truncated ending at 14, or a papyri could have just been damaged. It just kind of tore off. So those are the arguments against that being the original version of Romans. Then you have another argument for not the shortest version, but the shorter version, that Romans 1 through 15 is original, but chapter 16 was added, but it was added for Ephesus to commend Phoebe there instead of Romans. And the doxology in the manuscript is after chapter 15, verses 33. And then chapter 16 is tacked on. So that except for verses 25 through 27, doxology is right after verse 33 in chapter 15. Now, arguments for this is that in chapter 16, Paul lists too many people. How would he know that many people in Rome when there's so many connections to Ephesus there? He spent a whole lot of time in Ephesus, right? Several years. So that could have just been attached as a repurposed version in this, with Priscilla and Aquila being greeted. like I said a minute ago, that was the last place we left them in Acts. Epaenetus was the first convert in Asia. Why would he be greeting him in Rome? And they think that verses 16 and 17 of chapter 16 reflects concerns from Ephesus, which, I mean, Paul's dealing with Jew, Gentile, tearing down walls, one new man in Christ too. So I don't know how far that flies. But the arguments against that is that chapter 16 is kind of a strange letter of accommodation for Phoebe, and then hi to everybody you can think of, to just kind of tack on to this shorter version of the book. And there's no prescript there. So epistolary prescript is like the first portion of the letter. The postscript is, if there is a postscript, sometimes Paul ends with just a doxology, but some of his letters and other letters, epistles, end what's called epistolary postscript, which is the final statement and greetings out, not there. When Paul knows a lot of people, he doesn't greet as many, but when he doesn't know people, he's kind of trying to ingratiate himself, right? The reason why he's greeting so many people in Rome is that he's trying to establish himself among people who are established there, who can vouch for him, considering a lot of this letter is him defending against false charges about his gospel of God or gospel of Jesus Christ. So if he can point to all these people and say, I'm okay because they think I'm okay, then he wants to be able to do that. Another thing is, if you think about it, we'll say he doesn't know that many people, right? He doesn't know everybody that you could think of. Well, one of the things that you would want to do is make as many contacts as you would, whether he knows them or he doesn't know them well, to make sure that he's trying to show honor to as many people as he can think of. So either way, it makes sense within the context of a church that he wasn't founder of.
So chapter 16 is authentic.
I go with the fact that Romans, from verse 1 all the way to the end of chapter 16, and I know
big surprise.
I can hear Nick screaming through the chat if he's still paying attention. I know he doesn't, and he wanted to fuss about this.
Nah, he left a long time ago. He's
we believe God. I mean, we're not King James onlyists, but we still believe that the Bible that was handed down to us is more or less the Bible that God inspired from start to finish, and that as they exist are probably as they were written. But
Praise
your
the Lord.
mileage may vary on that, but I'm going with
my mileage doesn't vary.
So wait, Nick Quient believes it like the shorter version.
I one of them. I don't know which out of the six.
Right. I just
he was supposed to join us tonight, but he's not here to make the case of why the Bible's wrong. Or
that's See,
there we go.
You don't
see how I
things a little more lively.
See how I put that in the worst possible light.
Yeah, and you're right, because he's also an egalitarian like you. So let's move on to the outline issues.
All right, we might get this under 3 hours. All right. So we're not going to do a full outline like you would find in a commentary. We're just going to do section by section. But the issues regarding the outline can go back to some of the conversations we were having earlier, that if this is a situational level, and I think letter, and I think all of us agree that this is situational, dealing with a specific situation of Rome for whatever purpose or purposes. Do we all agree on that?
What are you saying? Is it situational?
An occasional letter?
Yes, they're all occasional letters.
Yes.
Well, yeah, unless people argue that they're not, which some people do argue.
Yeah, but they are.
Yeah, they're wrong. Yeah,
I mean, you haven't read commentaries without telling me, man. I mean, people think that Ephesus was not to Ephesus because there's manuscripts missing to in Ephesus, just like in Rome is missing and stuff. But see, I think a lot of that could be explained simply. They wrote these all originally as occasional letters, but since they copied and shared these letters with other congregations, sometimes they may omit things like in Ephesus or in Rome because they're just trying to get the gist of it. But why are there so many of these general theological treatises? Why does it seem like Brax is like he may have stumbled into it, but it seems like there's general theological sections here. And how do those sections relate to the situation if it is situational? Why are there so much of that?
Are you asking a question for the panel to discuss?
Yeah, so that this isn't, all me. Not that there's a problem with it being all me, but like you reminded me today, you told me today, we have a Trinity Radio Extra you don't ever tend to. If you want to just bloviate for 2 hours, just go to that channel.
Well, you laid out some of the things there, like, okay, he's trying to familiarize his audience with himself, and he's dealing with these issues, and so you're going to need to lay out your basically your mode of thinking on some of these things in order to draw some unity toward those, as MJ said. And with the issues at play, it just seems to be the case we need to go ahead and just do some, whether you intended to do it or not, do some systematic theology, teach these people the theological reality that I'm presenting them with.
I mean, my biggest thing is when we're looking at the outline of issues, just understanding what they were probably meaning in their own context. So one of the biggest issues is just in general, when people read these sort of outlines, like as you have it outlined here, I have Keener's commentary pulled up over here. He outlines them. It's just understanding the kind of what he is actually trying to drive at, as opposed to what we sometimes think. Because one of the biggest sins I think that we do is read scripture with Western eyes and from the 21st century, or some people from the 16th century, depending if you just read like Reformer commentaries. I mean, right here, like when you have is the center of the letter of justification by faith and righteousness of God in light or wrath. Like righteousness of God is oftentimes people think is this big thing against like he's right and there's sin, but righteousness oftentimes in Romans is dealing with how God's merciful and gracious even to Israel from the Old Testament. So there's a lot of this mirror kind of language that we kind of hijack some of the meaning when we're not quite, I don't think, fully understanding what he gets at, what he's getting at when it comes to God's righteousness being like covenant faithfulness, stuff like that.
Yeah, I would also throw Romans 7 in that in those sections where you say that are couched in Jewish ways in a Jewish manner. I think Paul is doing that thing.
Are you talking about the speech and character portion, the I?
Yeah.
That's going to be a fun one. I know Nick and I have a debate on that on this channel. Yeah, that's a couched a very Jewish issue and a very Greco-Roman rhetorical device, though.
You and Nick have a debate on that on this channel?
Yeah, you moderated it.
I did?
Yeah.
I have no memory of this.
Oh, you're just kidding. You really don't have a memory of it.
I'm serious. I don't know what we're talking
there.
about. Oh,
yeah,
man.
I was listening to it on the way back from Salado, I believe.
Oh yeah.
So
who is the I of Romans 7, you know?
Well, I mean, I'm still not persuaded either way at the moment, but I tell you who it's not. It's not Paul.
Right.
Okay. I'm convinced that it's not Paul.
You know, getting serious.
We can I think the Adamic I got something going for it. But considering that he's talking about the law, considering that he's talking to those who know the law, I mean, they could also, you know, be it could be a Jewish eye there. I think that has something going for it. But so we would need to make an inference to the best explanation, considering all the biblical data. But it's not Paul. Otherwise, you make what Paul said in Romans 6. You turn all that on its head,
and all of what he says in Romans 8 on its head. So,
and what he says in other epistles on his head.
Yeah, but I mean, it seems so. You know, he's heavily oriented to a Gentile audience in chapter 1 through 15, chapter 11, 13. You know, he specifically calls out, "I'm talking to you Gentiles" in chapter 11 there, and then but you have the major theological sections. The first section, then the first 4 chapters, and then chapter 9 is so just dominated with Old Testament citations, echoes, and allusions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it raises that issue of how much of a Gentile audience know of the Bible. I mean, I think they could know some, but you would have, like any congregation, you have some people who know more than others, sure, you know, and then those who are elders of the church would be the most attuned to that. But you know, I
would
guys,
argue that the general sections always wind back to the larger theme, though. They don't. They're just like segmented off neatly, other than the chapter markers in our Bibles, because he always, you can see the thread throughout the whole thing where it's Jew Gentile, because I always go back to he's been dealing with that for 20 years. You're getting his reflections on how he dealt with that and how he integrates all those things, and so it's always, and it gets personal and it gets community, and there's a little bit of everything, because it is pastoral, but I don't think he ever really separates out. Well, and we also know from other letters, I mean, Paul's not exactly known not to chase rabbits, though, too. I mean, sometimes he kind of, he'll start to say one thing, and when he starts writing another thing too. So there might be some of that going on too. He goes a little longer than he planned on, especially if he's dictating it.
I think
like no one in this room did that.
Yeah, I think we lost Leighton, and I just want the next guest on Leighton's 5-hour live streams, bail early on him.
His wife needed him, and you know how that is. If your wife needs you, I want you to get off the stream, Jonathan.
My wife is going to have to wait
pretty soon.
Let's move forward. This is the last slide of the whole place. So
my wife is going to have to wait.
Point 3.
Yeah, but I do want to address that talking about how these sections relate to each other. If this goes back to what kind of Paul do you think is writing here? Because is the center, is the heart of the letter that first portion? Is it that second portion of Romans 5, 1 through 839? Is it the section Romans 9 through 11? Is that it? Or is Paul's main concern all of that just to get to the 12 through 15 stuff? Or is it just Paul's talking about all that just because he wants to talk about what he wants to get out of it in verse 14 through 32, which is actually the only place that kind of gives us an inkling of why he says he's writing. So
I think we're.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know which one I think is the center. I know the Lutheran Paul wants to favor the first 4 chapters, and then the Calvinists are right along with them until they get to chapter 8, verses 28, and then go through chapter 9, and then probably not even read the rest of Romans because they probably don't care. But no, I'm just kidding.
And Jonathan.
But then you've got all those practical pastoral issues he's sorting out that I don't think would make sense without all of that prior to it. So I don't know where you find the center.
Well, this is bad news, because I would have come to you and just said, Jonathan, where's the center of, and you wouldn't have known.
Well,
but you could have given me a TED talk for 20 minutes about it.
If I had to pick a center, I'd say go back to the church in Israel, but it rings out because that's how we all talk especially when we're dealing with people, and you do have some are less mature, some are more mature, some are leaders, some are just followers, some are barely saved, if that's a thing. And so all those things are included, but I'd probably pick the church in Israel issues is the bullseye, but then the next out, it all relates to that, because anytime you're presenting anything, you're going to connect it to other things, and he establishes that and goes on to the pastoral issues after he lays the foundation. That's the cards I'll play. But
amen.
Well, yeah, that's very pastoral answer, very wise. So
it could be right. It could be the right answer as pastor.
It might be. I mean, there's an awful lot of commentaries in it. But most things are that way when you're talking to people. We have to remember he's writing to a congregation. He's not writing to some theology student. He's writing to people they stood up in the front of the room and said, "Hey, we got a letter from Paul. Everybody listen up. Here we go." And read it. And we got some guy that was slave by day, and other guy that was, I mean, of course he would have included all those different things.
Yeah.
Especially if he's kind of representing himself in one big kind of reflective treatise.
Indeed. Well, that concludes our stuff.
Oh, well, there you go. I didn't know it was conclusion. I ended better.
We'll go around the room and let MJ give his thoughts, and then we'll go around and I'll close this out.
Yeah, this was fun. And this I'm enjoying the format here. Certainly awesome to listen to everybody's perspective. I want to do a shameless plug for a second. So me and Nick Quient, more so Nick than myself, he presented on the Apocalyptic Paul on my channel. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go check out the Urban Christian Institute on YouTube, and that's MJ Jackson, the Urban Christian Institute. And so we kind of lay out the apocalyptic perspective. And me, I would consider myself more of a modified, begrudgingly holding to apocalyptic, but I think it got a lot going for it. But no, I enjoyed tonight, and I enjoyed listening to everybody, and I'm looking forward to Romans 7, so we can annihilate Calvinism. Everybody runs to
in
Romans
the year 2038.
Everybody runs to Romans 8, Romans 9. I'm like,
we'll be sure to have a Calvinist on. So
come on with it. Come on with it. We can put compatibilism to bed and all that.
There you go.
Tough talk from MJ Jackson.
I don't know.
You got it.
Wes?
I think MJ Jackson can back it up, though. So, no, this is fun. I'm really enjoying the intro to Romans. There's a lot of debates surrounding, of course, Paul and Romans and all that. I've already given my thought. I'm somewhere between new perspective and apocalyptic. But bottom line is that there's a lot to consider here. And I think as we move forward in this series, as we consider the historical context of what's going on in Rome and Paul's intent of the letter and everything, a lot more Romans is going to come to life, as opposed to sometimes the very wooden approach that we see so popular in the evangelical and Baptist Reformed circles that we oftentimes get. So I'm excited for it. Romans is a personal favorite of mine. I really like Romans 8 and 9, actually, even though I'm not a Calvinist. I love Romans 9 because I think it kind of actually drives home this idea of covenantal messianic heritage that's kind of going on there. So I'm excited to go forward and start actually unpacking the text, because that's kind of more my thing, is I love to exegete. So as far as like longer endings and shorter endings, I just shrug and go, I'll take what I got.
Brett?
Well, I just want to bless you all. Praise
the Lord. You've been a blessing.
No, I appreciate it. It's an honor to be nominated. It was very good to be here. and it's been a long time since I did very, very formal study and teaching of Romans. So, but I always heard it said that you see the Bible differently as you change, and you go back. It hasn't changed, but you do change. And so revisiting it after a lot of years and a lot of experience and a lot of seeing a lot of things and going through a lot of things, that brings new information, and it's fun to hear what the latest viewpoints are and all that. So I'll be anxious to hear how the discussions go. So
yeah,
and I'll get to be in another one, but
I want to mention that in the description there is links to all the channels that were represented here tonight, and I didn't put Nick Quient in there, although he's going to be with us at some point, I'm sure. Sub to his channel, because we mentioned a lot of his stuff tonight. And you can just click on his profile thing in the chat to go to his channel there. But this has been a blast. I've enjoyed it. And Jonathan, I'm glad you put it together. Now in the future, maybe I'll have to try and move things along so that we stay a little bit ahead of the Flowers. By the way, Flowers wanted me to say to you, I'm actually having, that's him talking to me. He said, tell Jonathan any guest that I have who stays on for 2 hours is welcome to jump off. LOL. So anyway, this was great. And let us know in the comments if you liked this. Of course, if you made it to this part of it, you must have liked it. So,
or you dozed off.
Yeah. But I would like to know whether people like this, so we keep it going.
It could be hate watching.
Yeah. There was definitely some of that happening tonight on this channel. I'll tell you
next week, hopefully most of us will be here. We'll try to keep bringing in new faces, as well as just getting used to our faces. We'll be getting into Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. If you guys want to dive into that and hear what we have to say next week, we hope that you come back Thursday nights at 6:30 for the Biblical Rogues Gallery. We hope to have more rogues come in next time. And by the way, most of the time it will be on Trinity Radio. But sometimes we may need a break, but the show will go on. So you will find it either at MJ's channel maybe sometime in the future for one Thursday night off, or on the church split one Thursday night. Most of the time here, we'll give you plenty of advance notice if we're going to have to move it to another thing because Braxton's bored or tired of it or whatever, or he's doing something less important than video games, like actually preaching the gospel in a church, which we hope that you will invite him to your church. So that,
and that was like the biggest segue I've ever seen. Somehow video games made it in. I don't even know what that was about. And
just like Brett came to impart a spiritual gift, Braxton would like to have some fruit among your congregations as well.
Braxton, I'd like to formally invite you to my church.
Oh, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. I will accept.
It's been done.
This coming Sunday. I'll be there.
This coming Sunday.
That's how that
You don't
works,
want to miss it.
All right.
This has been a blast. Do you want to close us out, Jonathan?
With prayer.
Oh, okay.
Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this time of fellowship with those who showed up for the round table, all those in the chat who are talking. Lord God, I just pray that you will give your church the same spirit of unity that your spirit that dwells in all of us would have us to have. Paul's aim with the book of Romans was unifying congregations. So, Lord God, even if we have a little fun and take shots here and there, that it's all just as, no harm intended, just having fun and fellowship, and we can take the shots as much as we give them. And Lord God, we just pray that you'll take this ministry that we have on all of our YouTube channels and in our local churches, Lord God, that we can be a blessing to our communities and that we can bring you glory and proclaim your gospel to all. It's in the name of Jesus I pray. Amen. Thank you. Right. And we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.